What's going on, everybody?
You can do other things and you can explore different aspects of yourself and you can become a different person.
You can't use your voice, lift someone else's voice up.
Understand that you are a global citizen and you do have a responsibility.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Life Outside the Box podcast. As always, I'm Abigail, joined with my amazing co-host, Desanti. And today we have a very special guest on. She's actually a reoccurring guest, Mikaela. And we are very, very excited to dive into this conversation about her research with suicide prevention and how it interconnects with poetry and language. And it's a good one, so stay tuned. And as always, thank you for Chemico for sponsoring today's episode.
Yeah, hi. I'm so happy to be back and be in conversation with both you, Abby and Asante. It's a great way to end such a tough month. End it on a good note for sure. But yeah, I'm Mikaela, and I am a writer, researcher. My focus, I guess, within those things is poetry and suicide prevention. But I write lots of other things as well. And once upon a time, played basketball for Stanford and for Team Canada. So that's a big part of my life as well. But yeah, I am very, very happy to be here and chatting with you both. So
I guess before we officially get into the depths of the conversation, we should just go around the table and check in with each other. I guess contact as to why we were sort of lamenting on this month. It's the start of the new year, and wow, everything's just packed on the news, and then sprinkling a little bit of seasonal depression, and where we are, there's a crazy amount of snow, which makes you not want to commute to work, and it's just January always feels like a heavy month. So I mean, maybe Asante, I'll lean it toward you, but how are you doing?
Personally, I think I'm doing quite well. At the same time, I have a lot of worries, I would say, about what's happening. I would say in the world, which would be accurate, but in particular, south of the border in the United States with Donald Trump. It's like every day there's just a new thing that I'm like, are we living in a movie right now? Just every day there's just something new where I'm just like, I literally cannot believe this is happening. So, how am I doing? Personally, I'm okay, but I'm also very, very, not even concerned. I'm troubled by what's happening down south. And there's a part of me that also wonders how much of that is going to arrive up here in Canada. And when that does happen, because it feels like it is going to happen, how do we respond? So.
Yeah. How are you doing?
I mean, I echo all of that. And I mean, I think there's also something to be said for we're just digesting all of this in real time via social media, and you can sense in your own energy and in other people's energy, everybody's just carrying it it's heavy. That constant balance between being informed and being aware and trying to advocate and where you can. And then also taking care of yourself in a really tough time of the year to begin with, in January. And yeah, my birthday was early in January, and I just remember feeling like that was the first week back to work for most people, back to school. It was January, the second week, I guess, of January. And just feeling it was hard to like look forward to things or find things to look forward to. So trying very hard to figure out like what that balance is of feeling like I'm participating in a really good way in advocacy / like just talking about things and being honest and being aware. But then also like this is a time of rest, like nature is resting, and I think we should be too, to an extent. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
I love your point about like resting and, nature is resting and to take it easy on ourselves. And Asante, I love the point you made too, but like, how do we respond? Like being troubled, feeling unsettled and angry, and just figuring out how to respond to the world when it gets the way that it is currently. And I mean, sort of reflecting a little bit, Mikaela, the last time we had you on the podcast was like 4 years ago, I think, 4 or 3 years ago. A lot has changed, not only the world, which, we'll take a break from the craziness for a minute. What have you been up to in these years?
Oh, big question. Um, I have been up to a lot. But I think probably the biggest thing is since I was on the podcast, I have made a very strong, stark pivot from writing and speaking kind of solely about my basketball career. When I first graduated from Stanford, I was involved in a lot of athlete mental health conversations and research and writing. And I always kind of knew that writing was in some capacity was where I wanted to end up. But by nature of being an athlete and being such a, quote unquote, like high performance athlete, I kind of got pulled into feeling like, or I guess feeling guilty if I didn't follow that path. And kind of allowing that to be my identity in its entirety. And so I think the biggest change for me is I've shifted almost entirely away from that. Obviously still a big athlete mental health like advocate. But I've started to write and speak and get involved in other things that are more about, mental health at its core. And, how do we write about that? How do we speak about that? How do we generate words for things like that? And look at it, I guess, maybe at the root instead of, letting basketball kind of dictate, or my basketball career kind of dictate what spaces I felt like I was allowed to speak in, if that made sense.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I've been around a lot of athletes who, after like their collegiate career or pro career ends, they have a lot of difficulty in transitioning, particularly in terms of the identity piece, which you brought up. So I'm curious, as you sort of made this transition, what impact, if any, has there been on sort of reforging, reclaiming identity? What has that been like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I've allowed myself to find or get to know maybe like different parts of who I am now that I don't play basketball for 6 hours a day. And I'm not constantly engaged in that world. Like I actually hardly watch basketball anymore or watch sports anymore. And I think it's been a very healthy thing because I've gotten to know the parts of me that really enjoy other things and really want to be present in other things. Whether that's writing or, places I like visiting in nature or books I like reading, like not feeling guilty if I'm not constantly embedded in the athlete world. And I think that's really helped me kind of grow into my voice and what I actually want to advocate for and say through the writing that I do. that of course ends up still being applicable, I think, to athletes because you're getting at something that's much deeper, or, the root of mental health issues as, systemic issues and how that's all very much connected. And so I think like I still have basketball as part of my identity, that career, that those relationships very much. But I've also expanded lots of other pieces and allowed those to kind of complement each other instead of, one being the controller and the other's always coming secondary.
I love your point about having like parts of yourself complement each other and not have one like dominating and like controlling. Because we talked about this in our past episodes, so if anyone's interested, they can go check it out there. But listening to you talk here, I was curious on how like your transition between basketball being your sole like identity and like your career and your passion into what made you want to sort of explore these other parts of yourself, like the writing and the arts and creative. Like what was that transition like?
Yeah, I mean, I think by nature I've always been a very like curious like person. As a writer and researcher, like I really want to get to the root of things and like understand things as deeply as I can. And I think I felt like I was missing something, I guess, like by talking about mental health like within one community and within only one community. I was like, there's something that I'm missing about staying entirely in that world. And so I think that was initially what instigated my like movement out of like, okay, when we look at something like suicide prevention, which I am very passionate about, like what is really the root of what we need to, or the conversations, writing, et cetera, that we need to spend time in. And how do I approach that from a writing/research angle? And I started really just trying to dig through the weeds of like, when we talk about suicide prevention, we're also talking about a lot of other things. And when I was initially like working on, there's one research project that I was putting together that was looking at poems that were related to suicide. And I was like, okay, how am I going to figure this out? Because when you really think about it, just about every poem is related to suicide because suicide is connected to everything that goes on in our lives, everything we have access to or are barred from or are intentionally kept from, etc. And so, yeah, I don't know if that quite answered your question, but I think I wanted to be more broad and like broad in the sense that I was looking at multiple different angles of issues versus through just one lens of my own experience, really. Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. I find that a lot of people who go into research, they either have like a problem that they're trying to address, or like a question that they're trying to find an answer to is probably, the better way to put it, or they maybe already have like an answer in mind and they're trying to find evidence that supports that answer. So for you now, thinking about suicide prevention, what has that journey been like in terms of what motivated you to want to really dive deep into this? Where did that curiosity come from? And, maybe what are you hoping that we can get out of the research?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, it's connected to personal experiences, of course. I have attempted suicide twice in my life. And I've lost excuse me, a childhood friend died by suicide when I was in high school. And I lost my therapist to suicide. And then a Stanford soccer player who I was roughly the same age as me, also died by suicide a couple of years ago. And so that has unfortunately been a trend in my life, or maybe trend is not the right word, but like something that has touched my life very deeply. And I really was thinking about like having experienced it from multiple different angles, whether that being myself or a friend or my therapist. And I really, really wanted to ask questions of, how does writing and research and poetry, like all of those different things, connect to why this happens, right? And how do we generate words and conversations and language to capture that? And so a lot of the research I'm working on now, and also writing that I'm working on now, is some of these really, really difficult aspects of suicide and suicide prevention that are most difficult to talk about verbatim, or just, even like in our day-to-day lives. What does it look like to generate a poem or language or a song or a short story that really captures the essence of some of those feelings, whether it's when you experience the loss or when you experience an attempt yourself or when you're just having the thoughts. And so I think I'm really like, I'm obviously personally invested in trying to get to the root of that. But also just as a writer, and again, somebody who's just very curious and likes to read, just trying to figure out, like, is there a better way forward? Is there a way that, the skills that I have can contribute to the suicide prevention conversation in a way that, hasn't been done. And the other piece I guess I'll add is another, area of suicide prevention that I'm interested in is this idea that a lot of our prevention methods to date are really focused around meeting the need of other people. And so when we hear something like, "You're needed," or "the world is a better place with you in it," it doesn't necessarily center the person who's struggling. It centers everyone else. And so I'm really interested in the idea of like, how do we help people see value in their own life so that you don't have this sort of like quantity over quality approach to, keeping people alive, putting them in a hospital on a 72-hour hold, for the sole purpose of stopping them from dying, right? How do we make sure that the world is actually a better place for them as well? Yeah.
This might be a bit of a loaded question. You're actively still researching, but how does it work? Like, not centering, the universe, but centering yourself in suicide prevention, and like your research with poetry and writing. Like, how is it connected?
I think what's interesting to me is that, I think it's less about maybe that it's centered around the self, and maybe more about, enabling people to feel like they're like connected to other people as part of a whole. And so the example that I often kind of refer to is, if you have, let's say, a single parent and they have 3 kids, a kind of other, I guess, oriented reason for living for them could be, I need to stay alive because I am the only financial support for my kids. And they feel that that's, the only reason, and they're kind of mentally framing it that way. Whereas, framed a different way, it could be, I want to stay alive because I feel a sense of value and connectedness with my kids and financially supporting them and meeting their needs. And I think those are 2 very different things. And it's not necessarily that, that parent has centered themselves in isolation in an individualistic kind of way. It's that they feel a relationship, a connectedness with that kind of environment, right? And their kids, and making sure that their needs are met, versus feeling like they're being extracted from, and that, that's their only reason is because, they have to fill some sort of gap for somebody else. And that's not reciprocal in any way. And I think there's examples of that everywhere, that all of us feel like, I have to stay in a job because of this, or I have to stay in this relationship because of this. And it's a very one-sided kind of approach. And like I said, I think suicide prevention messaging falters, in maybe accidentally kind of leaning on those tropes. Like, when you hear things like, you're needed, it's, when you really take that, in some ways it feels like needed. Why? Needed by whom? Needed for what? Whereas, or I guess versus, being a valuable member of a community or of a relationship or a family, etc. And then I guess where poetry and translating words comes in, I think poetry in particular has this unique way of being language is like source code almost. It's an ancient thing that has since been co-opted, in an academic, highbrow kind of way. That's very unfortunate, but poetry existed long before we ever even had the written word. And it's a really, really beautiful way of capturing, and maybe it's the closest to capturing, this difference between, or instance of reality and its representation. I think of any writing form, poetry comes closest to representing reality and giving words to reality. And I think for something like suicide, that we all struggle to find words for, whether when we experience a loss or we experience an attempt, or anything related to it, we really, really struggle to generate words for something like that. And so poetry is an avenue for that, for trying to identify that, I think is really interesting, and something that, we can look at. And, the idea of bringing poetry back to the people is something I am really passionate about as well. And, that includes spoken word and songs and lyrics and all those things too. So
Very interesting stuff.
glad. I feel like I'm rambling, but I'm glad it's interesting.
For me, as someone, obviously I'm a mental health person, but also as someone who does poetry or whatever, it's really interesting to hear you sort of start connecting these dots. I think that kind of leads into, the next question for me is you talk about poetry as being a representation of reality. And so, and you also talk about suicide and how that suicide and the experience of it is generally centered on, the folks who are outside of the person experiencing the feelings. So how do we come to understand the reality of the person experiencing the suicidal feelings? And you talked about need. How do we support the people experiencing suicidal ideation in first understanding what they need and then providing it for them?
Yeah.
I know, a big question.
That is the question, of course. Yeah, I'm tempted to defer to this really, really wonderful book. It's by Dr. Jennifer Mullen, and it's called Decolonizing Therapy. And it really gets into, what collective care really means, and how so much of mental health care in the clinical world, is very centered around the individual and self-care, and this sort of feeling that if you're not healing, you're just not working hard enough, or you're not tapped in hard enough and you're not going to enough therapy sessions, etc. And I think, it's also, this conversation is also really centered around the idea that, you do not heal in isolation. Like there's only so much that, quote unquote self-care as we think of it, a bubble bath is going to do. And so to encourage that, whether in the clinical world or in our communities and in our relationships, is problematic, I think. And I think there's definitely individual coping mechanisms that can be like really, really helpful. And we all need alone time and ways of, processing things, etc. That's an important part of our lives. But I think, helping people who are experiencing suicidal thoughts comes back to collective care. And it also comes back to that, it's either a story or I can't remember where it actually originated, but that idea that, if you walk into the woods and you see people drowning in a river, should you jump in the water and start trying to pull them out of the river, or walk up a few steps to see why they're falling in the first place? And I think that's such an important part of this. Like, suicide is a symptom of a sick society in a lot of ways, in a very manipulated, controlled society, and lack of access to resources, discrimination, racism, etc. The list goes on. And I think really when we talk about suicide prevention, we're talking about the social determinants of health, among many, many other things. And I think poetry and writing and those sorts of things can very much be in community in ways in which we can communicate and be in conversation with each other, in a way that looks like collective care. Whether it's in, those like third spaces, like coffee shops and libraries and community centers, those sorts of things that we don't necessarily think of as suicide prevention are suicide prevention.
I'm curious, switching gears here a little bit. I'm dropping stuff over my desk. But as a writer, and I mean, I think everyone here, like we've all written a variety of different things, and I'm curious the writing process. I love to nerd out about it, but I think specifically in this case, is there a different way you almost like prepare yourself or like take care of yourself afterwards when you go from like compared to writing like a short story about like regardless versus a short story or poem that like directly addresses suicide? Like how does that look like for you?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, well, I guess there's two things that happen. One is I go into it knowing it's going to be about something related to suicide. The other side or option, I guess, is that I go in thinking I'm going to write something else and it ends up being about suicide. And so I think, I mean, in both cases, for me at least, it matters, where I'm writing. There's certain things I know that I can't work on or write while I'm, around family at home, because it puts me in a sort of, vulnerable place that, maybe I'm then not the most approachable person around my family. And so I think it starts with being mindful about that. And also, I'm trying to think, like, it almost feels like in order to write about something really effectively, that's really been a deep part of your, core soul, spiritual, level of experience in life. It kind of has to be a bit like picking a scab. And, that that can be a really a good thing in terms of how the writing is conveyed, and how it comes across to other people and how they're able to relate to it if you're able to go deep. Um, but you also have to be mindful of yourself too. Like reopening a wound um, is, you know, there has to be boundaries, and like you said, ways in which you take care of yourself afterwards. And somebody I worked with a couple years ago, who works in storytelling, his name is Michael McCrae, told me in a session once that there's a big difference between writing from a scar versus writing from a wound. And I think that is a huge distinction, and one that's been really helpful for me. I think it's much safer for yourself as the writer and also for the reader audience, if you're writing from a scar versus a fresh open wound. Because of course your tendency when you're wounded, is that you'll wound others. You wound others via your own wounds. And we've all seen that in all of our families and all our relationships, right? Wounds will wound. And you don't always convey exactly what you mean or what you've been able to, fully process and hold and digest. And so I think really for me, that's probably the biggest distinction is once it is healed or maybe I don't think you ever fully heal, but once it's a scar, I think, you're better equipped and resourced to write from that place and write well from that place. And there's another analogy that I'm thinking of the way trees heal themselves. Trees don't, if you cut a branch off, that space where there's no longer a branch doesn't like go away. It becomes like a knot, right? It doesn't fully heal itself. It just closes off the wound. And so I think like keeping that in mind too, when you're writing from a very deep experience, always being aware that it's not something that's ever fully healed, and just being mindful and careful when you wade into those waters. Yeah.
It was really interesting. I have so many questions, and I think so many questions. At the heart of them, there's kind of this like overarching. There's always this talk of like artists being, writing their best work when they're like depressed or what have you.
Yeah.
And even for myself, when I've written from like a wound versus writing from a scar, sometimes the wound writing is very like visceral and like ugh, So for you, what no, like I guess how do you determine when to write from a wound versus when to write from a scar, and how do you know the difference, and how do you know what is like safe to put out into the world based on where you're starting from?
Oh, that's such a good question. Such a good question. I mean, I think, yeah, it's definitely a dangerous trope / stereotype of, the wounded healer and that, all artists are are depressed and that in order to make your most effective good work, you should be depressed and anxious. Like I don't think that's true. I think, yeah, there's a huge difference between being, depressed and being, really in touch with your emotions, and in touch with your grief. I think grief is a better term maybe to use, one that's applicable really to everybody. We all experience different types of grief, and being in touch with that and being connected with that throughout your life is a really valuable skill. But I think, yeah, when do I know the difference? Gosh, that's a good question. I mean, I hesitate to say time because I don't think it's always time that helps. I think it's a little bit more like environmental. Who am I around? What other things are going on in my life? Do I have things I can schedule, people I can connect with that are going to help me ebb and flow in and out of a certain mindset or space? I think that's maybe the answer. I'm not entirely sure. It's still honestly something that I'm learning, because definitely as like a teenager in my early 20s, I didn't make that distinction. I definitely wrote a lot that came across as not angry, but very bold in a lot of ways. And like that's not necessarily a bad thing. But looking back, I think giving it like 6 more months, or trying to write it intentionally in a different environment, around different people, among different things going on in my life, would have helped me kind of balance out and distill what I really wanted to say. I think I know now, if I can get an essay or a poem or a song down to one sentence of what do I really mean and want to say and communicate to people, and how's all that working together in tandem. If I can't do that, then I don't think I'm ready to write the whole thing. It's not connected enough. Whether that means it's, too emotional, too raw. But it's hard. Like I definitely don't have an exact answer, because I think it's different for everybody, and it's different depending on your topic as well. Something like suicide is really difficult, because having suicidal thoughts is not something that just, goes away. And I think that's true, honestly, for everybody. I'd be willing to bet that most people at some point in their life have thought of it. It's at least crossed their mind. And so is there an answer to whether or not you are ready or resourced enough to write from that place? I don't know. But I think you can do the best that you're capable of doing, and be surrounded by people and resources that, help you come in and out of that headspace as safely as possible.
I mean, when talking about like the workshopping of writing and being intentional and, you know, setting up your environment and all these steps to take for the writing process, I'm curious. It's almost like a controversial question among writers. I don't see why, but who do you write for?
Mm, yeah. You know, I think, well, I'll start by saying somebody once said, I believe it was Padre Gotuma, who is wonderful. If you haven't heard of him, he's a poet. He's an Irish poet. Said something to the tune of, every poem, he was talking about poetry, but I think this applies to other types of writing as well. Every poem that you write is actually just a stanza in this kind of global tapestry of the poem of the world. And so it's always connected to everything else. And so in that way, it's interesting to think about whether or not, it's really you who are the one who's writing something, or, if you're being environmentally or spiritually kind of led, in terms of an idea that gets put in your head, or what you're influenced by, what you're inspired by. And so I think that connectedness to nature, to other people, to the world, is really interesting to think about in terms of why we have the impulse to write a poem or write anything in the first place. But I also think, I definitely think about that, and I think about who within that web is going to read my work. But I think we also write to tell the truth about something, or to give ourselves something that we can't have in real life. And I think that's an important, part of the process for sure. And like you're generating something that's, to fill some sort of gap or, void, I think is a word that gets overused, but to fill something, fulfill something. But I think it's very much about the writer and the reader being in relationship with each other versus, a sort of like marketing thing, which is what makes, the idea of who's your audience very different. That's more of a, something that a marketing professional will say to you. Who's your audience? Who are you speaking to? Versus how am I in relationship with my readers? How am I having a conversation with them and meeting them where they're at, and also meeting myself where I'm trying to be for this, whoever's going to read what you're writing. And so, yeah, it was a very long-winded way of saying I don't really have an answer.
Isn't that life in a nutshell? No.
Right?
You talk about, the gap or the void to be filled. As you talk about that, I think about what is that for me? And for me, there's like this desperate need to be seen authentically. And that's like family stuff, trauma. But like, I guess, as you're speaking, I'm wondering, what is the gap for you? But I also think that when you start to think about like the conversation that you're having with the audience, as you put it, what gaps maybe are you trying to fill for them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, of course, you can get caught in the trap of thinking, I want to write something that's relatable to everyone. And of course, you could never like accomplish that as much as you'd like to. And I think I learned recently that the more personal and honest you write about your own truth, the more relatable you're going to be. Because when you do that, I think you're getting right at the core and right at the like instance of what's unsayable. And that's relatable for everybody. And that fills a gap for everybody. And I think, yeah, you almost really have to operate from that place. It's like maybe less a gap and more, how truthful can I be? And of course, writing allows you to, fudge the truth a little bit in terms of details. Like you can protect people's names and identities, etc. when you're, telling, let's say, a traumatic story from your childhood. You don't always want to name names and throw everybody under the bus. But, how close to the truth can you get? And how detail oriented and authentic can you be in sharing an experience, writing about an experience or a particular topic and how it relates to you? Because I think your reader or listener can always tell if you're really operating from that place, and that's what they're going to latch onto and feel connected to. Not necessarily the exact details that you're sharing, the exact locations, the exact like visceral objects, let's say. They're connecting to the underlying topics versus like the ostensible topic.
I mean, you're sort of like a jack of all trades in like the literary world. Like I've read your short stories and you've been published like many places. I was hoping to talk about your album. Tell us what what's going on there.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, first, something I never thought I would do ever. I'm not super musically inclined. Um, but around the time I was supposed to start my PhD, which is what a lot of the research I've been talking about was connected to. Um, I was supposed to start my PhD in Belfast in Northern Ireland in fall 2023, and things as we know financially are really a mess in Canada right now. Our dollar is, really low and the exchange rate is really difficult. And so I made a very challenging decision that I would wait because financially it wasn't feasible and I was going to lose, a large chunk of money like just in the exchange rate. And so I made a decision to stay, and I was also going through a lot of really difficult things at that time in my personal life. And so I felt really stuck, and like I still had things I wanted to try and say in the more immediate future related to suicide and how poetry can address that. And so I just kind of started writing. I was like, I'm just going to go for it. I'm not working right now. I'm not in school. I'm trying to figure my life out. At least I can do is just write. And I wrote basically a draft of a piece that addressed various topics related to suicide, things that I was thinking about, things that were connected to the project I wanted to do as part of my PhD. And I got to a point where I was like, this is the first time it feels like these poems are not going to be made better by more editing. There's something else that's missing. And I started thinking about like, what would it look like to put them to music? But there's so many who supported this whole process. Just were really encouraging and were like, this is your voice. You need to put this out here with your voice. And so it ended up being a really beautiful thing and like exactly what I needed to be working on during that period of my life, to still be able to say some of the things that I felt were very urgent and that I wanted to say at that time. So yeah.
So for anyone who's maybe not familiar with the album, and maybe for folks who should go listen to it, give us a little bit of what were you trying to say? Like, what are you trying to say through the musical piece?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's almost like it's a series of stories about kind of different pillars, I guess, that I was thinking about of the conversation around suicide. So there's one track called The Discovery that is about, what if we knew what happened after you die by suicide? What would happen? What are the questions we would ask if we knew the answer to that? There's another track called The Moth that's about the lead up to a suicide attempt, my experience with that. Because I think a lot of conversations are very centered around it being an impulsive act, and I don't think it always is. It's more of a haunting sometimes rather than a crisis. And I'm trying to think. There's another track called Guns, Pills, and Rope, which is about the fact that it's still very frowned upon to talk about suicide attempt methods. We often kind of cut the conversation off that there was a suicide attempt versus questioning whether discussing the attempt method is actually maybe valuable in some cases, and can help, somebody's healing journey. If we talk about, the why or the environmental, reasons, like something like access to guns. And I'm like drawing a blank on some of the others, but there's kind of, they're all kind of different different approaches like that, different backdoors into the suicide prevention conversation. Like, what are some things that I felt really hadn't been spoken about at length in a storytelling, poetic, musical setting? And I really wanted it to be like immersive. And so the spoken word tracks are, you know, set to this sort of like cinematic, almost like a movie score piano. And so they're meant to be, you know, an experience, a story, to evoke that feeling of holding those questions on a like somatic level.
I mean, I feel like this is a perfect place to ask this question as we're talking about things you never thought you would do, and like the different ways that life will surprise you. But as you know, as a former guest on this podcast, we like to ask, what's something you wish you would tell your past self? And I'm very interested to your answer.
Something I would tell my past self. Oh, this is always a tough question because I think you answer it differently on different points in your life. What would I tell my past self? I think I would say don't feel shame around not doing what everybody expects you to do. Which I think I would guess maybe a lot of people would say to their past selves. But I think for me, that really is centered around basketball in particular. Because I, as a teenager, was like, everybody kind of expected I would go to the Olympics. I was like the number one ranked like player in Canada for a while when I was like 16. And that was the path that I thought I would go down and that lots of other people thought I would go down. And I think I made a huge assumption that when I didn't go down that path, everybody in my life who had ever coached me or been a teammate or, you know, just been a part of my life at that time when I was really, you know, in the basketball world, I made the assumption that they were disappointed. And that wasn't true. And I recently actually reconnected with a couple of my high school coaches. And that was one of the first things that they said. They were like, you know, if basketball is not a part of this relationship, friendship, etc., like that's okay. It doesn't have to be. And I remember feeling like really taken aback and validated by that of like, oh, this like coach who spent so much time and energy on helping me develop my basketball skills isn't disappointed that I didn't take that as far as I could. And I just, that really like slapped me in the face. And so I think, yeah, that kind of thing is applicable to more than basketball, right? Like, you know, don't make the assumption that everybody's going to be, you know, feel pity or feel sorry or feel sad or feel like, you know, oh, that's a shame. You know, some people are, and I've had people say that to me for sure, like, oh, it's a shame or it's unfortunate. And in ways, maybe it is. But I've also had a lot of people, once I was willing to welcome them in and back into my life and in conversation, say that, you know, the reason that they were around me or got behind me or supported me in any way was not just because I could put an orange ball in an orange circle. And that was a huge like pivot mentally for me. So I think I would tell specifically my teenage self that to be mindful of that as she goes on into life.
I think that's really beautiful. And I think that's a story that, or an experience that can really extend to everyone's lives in a lot of ways. So thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that whoever's viewing this or listening to it will take a lot from it. Any last thoughts before we sign off?
Any last thoughts? Honestly, I think related, but maybe a little unrelated. There's a lot of conversation going around right now about like with everything that's going on in the world and how heavy and overwhelming things can feel. There's a lot of talk on social media about like find your community, like organize, find spaces to advocate, like all of these things. And I don't think we're saying that without really knowing what it looks like. I think it's really, really important to expand your idea of what community looks like and what, like we were saying, collective care looks like, what taking care of yourself looks like, taking care of others, and being really open to finding what feels good for you within that conversation, because we can't do it all, read it all, repost it all. It's not possible as much as we'd like to. And that, there's so many things that I'm sure everybody's passionate about and wants to get into and advocate for and repost 500 things on your Instagram story. And that's a good instinct. Absolutely. But I think for me, at least, I've found where is my skill set? Where can I really make an impact and contribute to all these conversations? And for me, I know that that's writing. Okay, so can I volunteer in a writing capacity? Do certain organizations need a volunteer copywriter for certain things? How can I be in community with people in that way? That is what collective care and organizing and, that's what it looks like, is kind of figuring that out. And then also take it a step further and say that is also suicide prevention, and is, a really important piece of this. So yeah, I'm just honestly feeling grateful for this conversation and ability to talk with you both, and your willingness to be, in a very vulnerable kind of conversation and space. So much appreciated.
Right back at you. I'm very grateful when talking about community to have this community here. To be able to have these spaces and have these conversations. And I think importantly, now more than ever, in a judgment-free zone, because, talking about online and it can get hard to be vulnerable. So I'm very grateful for the moments where we're able to be vulnerable in a safe conversation. Yeah. I want to thank you again for coming on and being our first recurring guest. Very happy that we were able to do this. And I know I definitely took a lot away from this conversation. So thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad. Well, thank you both again. Just very grateful. Well,